Hello, everyone, and welcome to our latest episode in our conversational event series with today's most exciting thinkers on the big topics related to our missions and innovation methods. My name is Will Woodward, the Discovery Research and Analysis Lead at Nesta. We are the UK's innovation agency for social good. We design, test, and scale solutions to society's biggest problems. And our three missions are to help people live healthy lives, create a sustainable future where the economy works for both people and the planet, and give every child a fair start. Joining me today, we have Nicole Kobie. Nicole is a technology and transport journalist with bylines in Wired, PC Pro, New Scientist, and more, and is the author of the brilliant book, The Long History of the Future. Welcome, Nicole.
Hi, Will. Thanks.
Before we start, I wanted to invite our audience to join the conversation in the comments box on the right-hand side of your screen and ask any questions throughout the event. Closed captions can be accessed via the LinkedIn live stream as well. So, Nicole, to start with, the long history of the future is an exploration of the technologies of tomorrow, from driverless cars to artificial intelligence. We've got robots, cyborgs, augmented reality, virtual reality, flying cars, hyperloops, and smart cities. And it looks at the history of all these technologies, the people who spawned them, and the people who in many cases have failed, and sometimes quite spectacularly, as they've strived to make them a reality. So, as a technology journalist for 20 years, Nicole, you've been covering many of these topics. Why did you decide to write this book, and what's important about this specific moment in time for us to reflect on the history of technological progress and some of the challenges with that?
Yeah, as you say, I've worked in technology journalism for, coming up on 20 years now, and I feel like I've been writing the same headlines kind of year after year, time and time again. Driverless cars are going to be here next year. AI is going to take our jobs soon. Humanoid robotics are, on their way. Just, give us another quarter and we'll get it all figured out. But the thing is, as fast as the pace of technology and innovation is these days, when you kind of take a step back and you look at the origins of these ideas, it's clear that it really takes a lot longer than we kind of realize. We lack historical context for innovation. And we kind of think that the cutting edge of today, of right now, is as good as it's ever going to be or ever going to need to be. So I thought it would be interesting to kind of look back at the history of it. And, you mentioned the characters. A lot of the stories are quite interesting. There's some really compelling people who were working on these projects. Some of them are quite funny. But the idea of why now, are we at a special moment in time? I think we could be. It kind of depends how AI pans out. But if I'm honest, I think that this book could have been written 10 years ago if I was, more on top of things, or I think it could be written 10 years in the future. I think most of this is all going to hold true. We're not going to have hyperloops at any point. And even if these ideas hold true, it doesn't mean that we're not going to get driverless cars. They're probably going to start popping up in cities in the next year or two. AGI might happen. It's just going to take longer than we think it's going to. It's going to come with some compromises. It's going to develop in a way that we don't expect. It's going to require other technologies that maybe aren't ready yet. So things are just going to be a little bit different than everyone is promising, and then maybe what we expect. That's not to say technology doesn't move at a fast pace, because it obviously is moving very quickly right now. That's a huge downside for me, because I'm always living in fear of being proven like completely wrong before the paperback comes out. And that's not for like another year. So thank you to my publishers for that stress.
That's really interesting. I think thinking about as I was going through the book and going back to the origins of some of these technologies, you don't really think that they've been, they started out so long ago in many cases, going back 100 years, more than 100 years even. So thinking about them being at the cutting edge now, actually people have been thinking about this for a really long time. And we're just seeing, like you said, the latest iteration. I think it's a really important way to think about this sort of, like you said, fast-paced world that we're in, with a lot of focus on the short term, when really change happens in a lot of cases over the long term. And maybe starting off with AI, you mentioned a few times there. I think of all the topics that you cover in this book, that's probably the one that's received by far the most attention over the last few years, especially since OpenAI released ChatGPT a couple of years ago. But also a couple of weeks ago, a Chinese startup, DeepSeek, unveiled its own large language model, which is open source. It reportedly costs much less to develop than some of the other models. It's cheaper, and supposedly less environmentally impactful than these other frontier AI models, although important to note various parts of that are disputed. What do you think the implications are of the emergence of DeepSeek in the AI field? Just thinking about what you've just said about the latest version is maybe kind of the one, not necessarily always the one we should focus on. And what does it mean for some of the challenges that you've articulated in the book when it comes to AI? Especially things like the environmental impact and the openness in the models as well.
Yeah, I think what DeepSeek showed is that Western AI developers, and we really mean American AI developers, are really hung up on their way of doing things. Like they think that the systems that they're designing are absolutely the right way to go. I mean, that makes sense because they've put billions into it. So, why argue with yourself? But DeepSeek shows that there are some other design ideas that we should be including and we should be thinking about. I mean, one of the core things that it's doing is it has the same, hundreds of billions of parameters that any of these systems has. It just doesn't use them all the time. Like it tries to be a bit more selective, and that cuts down on the amount of, computing you need, and that makes it way cheaper to run. And it means that you don't need as much energy, and that means you don't need as much cooling, and that means you can save on water. So these are all smart things to do from a financial standpoint, from an environmental standpoint. But if you can make a system with way more parameters than we have now and make it run on existing systems by being clever about which parameters you use, it also means you could take another leap forward with accuracy and reliability. So there's like a lot bundled up in this idea. And to me, the big question is, why were American AI developers not working on this? This is a very simple thing. This is a core part of technology. I mean, Intel's a bit of a has-been at the moment, but it always had this idea of a TikTok with its development. And it was you boost the performance and then you figure out how to make it more efficient. And they would just do that, every year and a half methodically. That was their business model. It was their system, and it worked for a really, really long time. And they haven't done that with AI. They haven't done, here's this big performance boost. They keep chasing performance regardless of the impact, regardless of how much money they're going to need. And maybe they just didn't think they were at the point where they needed to think about efficiency. And there's a lot of reasons why a Chinese company might have been forced to look at efficiency. And there's one kind of rumor that's going around that because of export restrictions, they weren't allowed to have NVIDIA's top chips. So they had to come up with a more efficient system. And ironically, these restrictions designed to kind of keep China back might have helped them take a step forward. But as you know, it's an open source system. So it doesn't just help China, it helps all of us. And we can, AI developers can take this code and they can apply it to their own system. They can try to understand it and come up with their own version. And that's great. And that's the way I would like to see this research going, because there's so much benefit to it. But there is kind of a really core question here about why Western companies didn't come up with this. And there was an incident from kind of 5 years ago with Google where there was a paper that was, some of their ethics researchers wanted to release. And it talked about these things. It talked about efficiency. It talked about coming up with new design ideas, new ways of looking at these, and not just going bigger, 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 because it was, unsustainable. And there was a lot of controversy around this paper and inside Google, and Google decided that if they released it, they weren't going to be continuing to work with Google anymore. And that's what happened. And I'm sure a lot of the people listening on this have heard about this paper. It's kind of known as stochastic parrots. So they were told 5 years ago, you need a better design, but they wouldn't listen to their own ethics researchers. They wouldn't listen to their own internal criticism. And had they would have been a huge step ahead, and we wouldn't have seen this big, sell-off in tech stocks and things like that. So I do think these big tech companies need to maybe learn to listen to criticism and realize that it's not an attack. It's actually, this is how you build better things. This is how you innovate, by thinking about what other people are doing and listening to critics.
That's a really interesting point. I think it also speaks to the sort of topics you cover at the end of the book as well, where there's a really interesting exploration of who builds the future. I think you highlight how, as you've just mentioned, most of the tech industry is sort of focused on Silicon Valley. It's where a lot of money comes from. It's largely white men. And maybe the example you've just given is a good illustration of this. But what are some of the consequences of that lack of diversity of experience and outlook? And should we be concerned when it comes to what it means for just advancing these technologies and technological innovation in general?
Yeah, absolutely. That example I just used, I mean, one of the, there were several researchers on it, but one of the people who ended up leaving Google, she is female and she is Black and she works in ethics. And it is hard to ignore the fact that there's a large contingent of women of color who are focusing on these ideas. And the simple fact is, whether DeepSeek got those ideas from that paper or probably from somewhere else, they were clearly looking at a more diverse range of thinking on this. And that doesn't have to be, demographics, that doesn't have to be those kind of identifiable features, but it's just finding people who are actually thinking about things differently and not just finding, yes men who are going to agree with you on every single point. Because we need, these are huge problems. AI is a massive technical problem. It's a massive engineering problem. It's a massive societal problem. It's going to, if it rolls out the way all these companies believe it is, it's going to require kind of all hands on deck. And if we don't have all sorts of people contributing to this, we're not going to solve these problems. And I think that DeepSeek is a very clear example of that fact, that we didn't have enough of the right people thinking in different ways, like in the room in Silicon Valley companies. And, they kind of got told that very publicly in a very dramatic way. So does that mean that Google needs to go out and hire, a bunch of female ethicists? No, it needs to listen to the ones that it actually had employed already, and start thinking about, what if we're wrong? What if there's a better way of doing things than what we are doing? Maybe we can just have a little side team who are working on, the what if we're wrong side of things. And if we don't get that kind of diverse way of thinking, like China has so much money that they're throwing at AI, and they see it as such a key technology for them, and rightfully so, that maybe they will overtake the US. And I don't think most people operating in US tech companies really want to see that happen.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting dynamic, and seeing how it plays out, and some of these factors in how companies are structured, and what role that plays is going to be really important to follow, and see how they adjust with things like DeepSeek. One last sort of question about AI before we can move on to some of the other areas that you covered. One of the consistent elements that you highlight in the book is that since the 1950s, since AI sort of started being discussed as a thing, the breakthroughs are massively overhyped and invariably followed by an equally massive backlash. It leads to funding cuts, slow research, and a seasonal cadence often referred to in the industry as a winter. I know a lot of people have opinions about this, but a few people have done the depth of historical research that you have on this topic. So are we currently just in an AI summer? And is there an autumn and winter to come, or is there something different this time?
I think we're undeniably in an AI summer, because the amount of money flowing into AI right now it is mind boggling. And there was a report, I was reading about this in the FT the other day. There's a report from BlackRock looking at how much money is going to be spent in the US on everything from like AI development, but also the infrastructure, so data centers and stuff like that. So we're talking like 325 billion just in the next year alone. That's and that's probably not everything. Probably more than that is going to be spent. That's a huge sum of money to be spending on one technology, and that's just in the US. I mean, there's tons of research happening here and across Europe and in Asia. I do think that the problem isn't so much, are we going to hit a backlash? Because I think it is inevitable, that we are going to have a backlash against this, and that's going to pull some of that funding out. I don't think it's going to be as extreme of an AI winter, or even really qualify as an AI winter, because there is enough utility to the existing technologies that they are kind of worth paying for some people, especially when it comes to things like software engineering, coding, that sort of thing. People are starting to find some value in it, and that might be worth paying for. And as long as people are willing to pay for it, you can get funding for things. Um, but I think we need to find more balance instead of doing these seasonal things where we just chuck a bunch of money at something because we all get excited about it and it gets overhyped and all of that. And we want to get in and make that money ourselves, because that is how funding works in tech. Instead of doing that, we need to be more balanced. We need to put a reasonable amount of money in. We need to put the money in that it requires, and then look at other technologies that we require to make this work. So one of the things that I thought was really interesting about how we got to this stage of deep learning is it required somebody developing the models, like doing the maths. And that was largely Jeff Hinton, which is why he's won so many awards of late. But his technology, his ideas were kind of, not ignored, but kind of set aside because they couldn't be made to happen technically. So we needed to get enough processing power, and then that kind of came from NVIDIA with GPUs. So that's kind of two elements of three that we needed. We also needed data because these systems are trained on so much data. It just happened to be a coincidence, well, or foresight on her part. But a researcher out of Stanford called Fei Li had this idea to create a huge database of images and label them. And without that, none of this would have happened. We needed all these different people coming together at the right time. And nobody was paying her to do that. NVIDIA was working on gaming stuff, and everybody just got lucky that this, was applicable to AI. So I think we need to be looking at what other technologies do we need for AI to work? What other technologies will be enabled by AI? So we should also be working on those things. And then also just other stuff. There's tons of other technologies that are deserving of investment and we're ignoring because we only have money to put into AI. So that's a very long way of just saying, I think we should set aside ideas like AI summers and AI winters and just try to, look at a full year at, that would be a nice way of doing it, and try to be more balanced and make sure that everything is getting the investment and attention it needs, and that we're not just getting our heads turned every 10 years by AI and then get mad at it and ignore it a bit.
Yeah, I think that brings us on to maybe sort of the topic of innovation more broadly. Nest is an innovation organization, as I mentioned at the start, and I'm curious to hear what you've learned about how innovation happens from your research of these different technologies and how it works in different cases. There's the example you've just given of just throwing loads and loads of money at a problem and hope that the people who are coming up with the radical ideas and can sell them the best, maybe they'll come to fruition at some point. But are there other sort of models and ways that we can think about this and maybe, as you've just been describing with AI, sort of be a bit more considered and cautious in how we approach it?
I think that it really highlights the importance of kind of government and public institutions, as well as universities, because so much of this work would not exist. Like a lot of the stuff with AI is happening in private organizations now. It's happening in Google, it's happening in OpenAI, Anthropic, and the rest. And all of those people were poached from universities. They were working at a university when they initially got hired into, the private sector. And a lot of this work came out of very specific universities that got good funding and had really smart people doing really clever things. Um, and I think that maybe technology companies need to be a little bit more honest about that. They need to be honest about where some of this stuff actually comes from. So they're sort of doing the finishing work after several decades of academic work. There's nothing wrong with that. That is how innovation and technology has happened. I mean, smartphones would not have happened if it wasn't for just so much research happening at academic institutions. And that's fine. But there's also kind of some reticence from technology companies to sort of pay their own way and to, like there's a lot of, tax avoidance and things like that. And I think that they should be actively funding universities a lot more aggressively, setting up some more public funding and things like that, to try to, enable this stuff to happen, because the public side of things is just so important at the kind of quiet, lower unhyped level. I mean, Jeffrey Hinton was working for decades on this stuff before it went big and before he, sold up to Google. Who was paying his wage? It was, I mean, Canadian taxpayers and Scottish taxpayers before that. Like I'd like to see a little bit more honesty on that and maybe a little bit more willingness to pay into the whole thing. But I also think it's worth noting that like innovation happens in kind of a really chunky way. We tend to just see like a nice, graph on, you could just kind of picture it on a chart, just this beautiful smooth line, but that's kind of not how it happens. And I think one really good example is with, so-called flying cars, kind of more like flying taxis or electric helicopters, really. But there was this guy working in the States, a guy named Paul Moeller, who was trying to just build a flying car for most of his adult life. He started in his garage, he started in his driveway, then he got a bit more space and, had a bit better setup. And he was never going to really be able to make this happen. Because a lot of things he didn't have. Computer controls didn't really exist then. Uh, Electric propulsion wasn't a thing that was going to work. The level of automation we have wasn't going to work. But one of the people who worked for him for a while went on to found Joby Aviation, which is probably the company that is going to bring us flying taxis, or whatever you want to call them, or at least one of the companies that is going to do that in the next few years. So sometimes these projects that are kind of seen as failures, or seen as, well, he didn't have the money, he didn't have the timing right, but it's still leading to flying cars. It's still kind of part of that trail. And I think too often, maybe for political reasons, or, just the popularity of an idea, we suggest it's not a good idea because it hasn't come to fruition. But it's helped along the way, if that makes sense. So I think we need to see innovation as not a thing that if we do this, then that will happen. It's if we do this, like a million different things are going to happen. We do not know what they're going to spark. We don't know what technologies are going to come out of it. And that's why you continue to do science rather than just product development.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to explain it that way. I was curious to know, going back to the research coming from universities, is it still the case that there are these big sort of research things going on in university labs, and we can keep looking to those for future technologies, or is that similar to kind of a lot of funding coming from military sort of sources, 40, 50 years ago? Is that also something that's changing now, and it's being brought in-house of these big companies, or are universities still kind of a hotbed of research and innovation as they were previously?
I think they probably still are. But when it comes to something, like a trending topic like AI, if you're working at a university, you're post PhD, and you're good at AI development, and you know what you're talking about, and you're an expert in LLMs or some other related technology, you're probably going to get a job offer from one of the big companies, and it's probably going to be a salary beyond your wildest dreams. They have the money to poach people out of the academic world. And that's fine because, they're kind of taking it into a product development phase, and they need these people. But there's a lot of technologies that are being developed, a lot of stuff around, like climate change, and building efficiencies in computing and quantum computing and stuff like that, that is happening at both levels. It's happening in companies and it's happening at universities. And that's probably a good way for it to happen. We need people who aren't just thinking about an end product, but are trying to actually solve a problem, or just trying to explore an idea and see if it's even, physically possible to do. So I do think a lot of that is still happening, in the the world of universities and research labs and whatnot. But I think for AI, a lot of it has just gone kind of in-house now.
Yeah, I think that seems to echo some of the ways that we've been looking at this as well, where it's really important to look at the system as a whole and look at how much, is there fertile ground being laid at universities, which is then being supported with commercial ventures and so on, being developed later on, and how are those things interacting versus just, too much waiting on either end, where you either have a large amount of research being done at universities, but no clear commercial applications, and vice versa, piles of money being poured into VC, but without the sort of research background and so on. So having that balance seems to be really important. Maybe moving on to what I feel is the most important question: where is my flying car, and will I ever have one?
So whenever I do an event for the book, that is like the one question people are like, yeah, but where's my flying car? So the short answer is the first flying car was certified in the US in 1956. So you could have had one. They only ended up making 7 of them, and there's some good reasons for that. That it was a car called the Aero car, and it was like this little tiny, like little dinky car. It's quite squashed and probably not much fun to drive. And then the wings could kind of fold out, and like the propeller was attached off the back. I think this was the one where you pulled it out of where the license plate goes. Like they came up with all these brilliant ideas for making these like transforming vehicles. The problem was it cost a lot to make. So it was $12,000 at the time. And you could have bought a really nice car for about $2,000. And also you could have bought a private, like a small plane for $2,000. So that would have left you with a lot of money, just left over to spend on, I don't know, buying a house or something. They probably cost that back then. But it didn't actually solve the problem. So when we all kind of fantasize about flying cars. We're sort of picturing it taking off from our roof or from our driveway or whatever like that, and just, being able to just go off and not have to deal with traffic and, just it sounds like a really like free, wonderful idea. Now, the reality is you can't take an aircraft from a residential area. The wingspan on anything that is built like a plane is wider than a road. So your neighbors are really going to hate you because you're going to smash up all their cars as you take off. Anything like a helicopter, I mean, even these wonderfully quiet ones that they've developed are still quite noisy, and they just blow everything around. So if anybody's cat has the misfortune of being down there, if somebody put their bin bag in the wrong place, it's just going to go flying. These don't work. So what that means is you have to go somewhere to take off. So you need to go to an airport, or they're calling them vertiports, and they're talking about for this flying taxi idea that will be able to take off from the top of buildings or whatever like that. So you have to go somewhere still. So it's not a flying car. It's never been possible to just be driving in traffic down the motorway, see that there's something up ahead, and just take off. That wonderful idea. You'd have to drive to the airport. And if you're going to have to drive to the airport, why not just have a dedicated flying machine rather than one that can kind of do both? Because when it comes to cars, the regulations around safety are very different to the regulations for a plane. So if you build something that can do both, they tended to be like these heavy, clunky, horrible, expensive machines that were terrible to drive and very, very slow to fly. So the short answer is you could have had a flying car, but they still don't do what you want them to do. The fantasy is never going to be a reality, ever. Like, I will happily bet money on that one. But what they are working on now, this idea of a flying taxi, kind of has the potential to do two things that I think are quite powerful. One is adding, electric to aviation, and being able to make, aircraft that can fly electrically is a big, huge thing for climate change and for emissions and that sort of thing. And obviously, we're talking very small vehicles, ones that can see, 5 or 6 people plus a pilot. So we're not talking big aircraft taking off at Heathrow or anything like that yet. But it's a good step forward to that, to see if it's possible. And because they're developing all of this, they know that the one thing that they have to develop alongside it is batteries. And if we manage to get battery energy density up enough to fly something that's similar to a helicopter or to a small plane, it starts to become believable that you could do it for larger planes and maybe start doing short haul planes that way, and things like that. And that really opens up huge potential for linking up countries like this one, where the trains all come into London. What if you could just link them up across the country using flying buses? That would be great, right? But nobody's fantasizing about flying buses. So the short version is you're not going to get a flying car. You might get a flying bus that might, take you east to west in this country instead of having to get on an actual bus.
I think that's it maybe speaks a bit to this idea of the vision that there is for technology in the first place. That there's a part in this chapter about flying cars where you sort of say we might keep asking for flying cars, but that doesn't mean we actually want one. And it strikes me that it gets to this issue of the ability to sell a story for an innovative technology and its potential future. What role does that sort of storytelling aspect play in these technologies? Because great, I think about flying cars. If I think about the future, I think about flying cars. It's been put on TV or in movies or whatever else. But as you describe it then, as I think about it now, I actually don't want one or need one right now.
Yeah.
If anyone wants to give me one, great. I'm not going to turn it down, but I definitely wouldn't buy one. So what role does sort of selling the story play in terms of making us think about the future and maybe making us not think about some of the practical considerations that we actually should be thinking about right now?
So I think storytelling is a really interesting phrasing for it, because I would call it hype. And it is like absolutely what fuels the tech industry. Whether it's AI right now, they're talking a lot about, what's going to happen when this AI is so smart that it can replace people. Is it going to become smarter than us? All that kind of thing. And like right now, it's struggling to answer my emails for me, but they're telling me this long off story about something that may or may not happen, may or may not ever be possible they think it is because it's good for them. It benefits them to believe that. And then we start talking not about what's directly in front of us, the is this a useful tool or not that is worth, you know, hundreds of billions in investment in a single year, but we start talking about, well, its potential. You know, if we don't have to work anymore, um, you know, if we solve all of these massive problems that we have, things like climate change and you know, treating cancer and all of these kinds of things with these amazing models, but it's always this far off vision. And I think that's the thing that I think is interesting about storytelling is it's science fiction. It's set in the future all of the time. And I would love for these technologies to be, you know, set in the now or even set in the past. It's why I wrote a history book, because it's very easy to fantasize about something, right? You know, you think about, I mean, my one isn't flying cars because I don't want to be up high. I don't like that. But I love the idea of a driverless car because I don't have my license anymore. I used to have it when I moved out here to the UK. The paperwork involved was huge. And I was just like, forget it. I hate driving out here. You people, the roads are insane. I do not want to be on these roads. So I don't have a license anymore. I would love the idea of being able to just go wherever I want without having to drive. Now, obviously that's possible because buses exist and Uber exists and cabs exist and I just make my husband drive me places. We have solutions, right? We don't need driverless cars to solve that little problem of mine. But if I'm going to be positive about driverless cars, that's what I'm going to think about. That's the story I'm going to tell myself. Look at this problem it's going to solve for me that, well, I just can't get by without them, sort of thing. But there are better answers to, you know, to the problems that flying cars are going to address. You know, we shouldn't be taking flights for short haul distances. If traffic is so bad we have to fly over cities, maybe we should fix traffic because not all of us are going to be able to fly. Anyway, so kind of setting aside all that, this idea of hype kind of being like a driver in the tech industry. If you aren't hyping your technology and people aren't talking about it, you're not getting headlines in Wired or TechCrunch, you're not going to get the funding. VCs would have to be so forward thinking to identify technology that no one else has heard of, find the startup or the academic trying to make it happen, and invest money in it, even though nobody else is talking about it. You would have to be so bold and so clever to achieve that. And there are people who meet that description, thankfully, but there's just not enough of them. It's so much easier to be like, that's where the money's going, which means more money is going to flow there. So if we could stop hyping things, I think we'd have more effective funding. But I'm not holding my breath. And given everyone still keeps coming up and asking me about driverless cars and flying cars, I think the hype is still working for those technologies. So I don't think we're going to lose it anytime soon.
Yeah, and it speaks to that sort of famous "fake it till you make it" culture as well. That is, in some cases, has led to companies like Theranos and the scandal surrounding that in the US. I saw a few days ago as well that Ethan Mollick, one of the leading thinkers in AI, posted. I think this relates to what you were talking about earlier. So another $500 billion was committed towards achieving AGI today. And most of the labs are genuinely convinced that they can indeed build an AI that beats a human at most intellectual tasks in the next couple of years. Yet there is still no articulated vision of what a world with AGI looks like for most people. What does that actually mean for most people, and what does their life look like in the future? So do you agree with this? And you know, that in this case, we're actually pumping a lot of resources and money and time and brain space into AGI, but no one is actually thinking about what the world will look like when that happens, and what are the implications of this kind of approach.
I think people are talking about that, but perhaps not the right people. So Sam Altman, who's the CEO of OpenAI, he talks a lot about what his vision is, and it's, you know, reducing the amount of work for humans, and that we're all going to share in the coming bounty of all of this. Because if AI makes everything cheap, then we're all going to benefit. But if AI is doing everything, then I don't know how I'm getting paid. And I think that's kind of what Ethan Mollick is sort of talking about, is this idea of, you know, they talk about the positives. I mean, they also talk about the really horrible negatives, like we're all going to be usurped by AI and, enslaved by it and all of that sort of thing. But I don't think there's enough discussion around who is going to control these systems and who gets to be in charge of them. So if a small group of US tech companies make AI, if they manage to make AGI or something that is human-like, and they can just roll it out to, to any kind of white collar job, so all of us, can start writing books. It doesn't need me anymore. But also to factories and warehouses via robots and machinery. Then what are we going to do is question one. And question two is, what does that have in terms of like an impact on the entire structure of society? If these handful of people are already like really, really powerful. Look at what's happening in the US right now. It's terrifying levels of power. But if they own labor and they don't need us anymore to do things, the amount of power that gives a handful of people is deeply alarming. And I think that is something that is sort of not really being talked about enough. I mean, people like me talk about it, but it's very easy to ignore a handful of like journalists and book authors and things like that. So I think the thing that we need to talk about is, how do we control these systems and how do we control the people that have developed them and own them? And I think that's one reason why open source is so important, is if we have an open system that we can access and we can build, at least we have some, at least we have some part of this game. At least we're in it a little bit. But the problem is we also need to own things like the infrastructure, the data centers, the compute required for all of this. And right now the upside is at least we have some power because governments still have all the power over utilities and things like that. So there's a whole bunch of data centers that want to be built all around London to do this kind of stuff. And for a large part, they're being told no. So I think we do need to think about, what is our control point over this? Whether it's our own systems, does that come from government? Does that come from academia? Does that come from forcing these systems to be distributed or open source? Like, I don't know how we solve that problem. And I think that is something that is absolutely not being discussed. And it is the problem that we need to solve very, very quickly, because if these systems manage to even just take over 30% of white collar work, that's a huge impact to all of us. And, I don't know. I'm a freelancer. I don't have a boss aside from myself at this point, but whoever you work for, do you trust them to keep you employed if they don't really need you? And if that happens to enough people, we're going to have a huge, huge shift in what type of work we do. And, we can't all become gardeners. We can't all become yoga instructors. There's going to be a limit to those kinds of like physical jobs that AI isn't going to be able to kind of do anything about. So yeah, I would like that question answered, but I'm afraid I don't have an answer yet.
Yeah. We're going to move on to some audience questions now. So there's a few that got submitted in advance. So I'll take a couple of those first. So firstly, what is the one thing that you would change about the intellectual property system with a view to encouraging innovation, and pushing technology forwards?
So I guess there's sort of two aspects of intellectual property that is worth considering. And one is sort of the patenting of key technologies. And like personally, I'd like it all to be very open source and to have things be accessible to everyone. But I understand that people need to make money or they're not going to invest in these technologies. So I think we need to be just taking a constant look at patents and what sort of control that gives individual companies or organizations or whatever. But generally speaking, when people are talking about intellectual property holding back a technology, what they mean at the moment is, so I'm kind of making an assumption about this question, but what they mean at the moment is data that these AI systems need, and people like me, journalists and authors and stuff, complaining that our work is being used and we're not being paid for it. So on that front, I don't think that intellectual property protections are holding back innovation at all. They are enabling it by encouraging us to create this content and allowing us to be able to own it. And the simple fact is, a company like OpenAI, and it's not just them, it applies to all of them, they have tons of money to pay their staff, to pay for compute. They spend billions on these systems, data centers and whatnot. They spend billions on energy and water for cooling, but they don't have any money to pay for data. And the key thing is, to run one of these systems, you need staff, you need the people writing the models, designing them. You need the technical side, you need the computers, you need the energy, you need the water for cooling, and then you need the data to fuel these, because without data, these systems don't exist. They're trained on it. So why do you have billions to spend on people, to spend on compute, but not to spend on words and pictures you don't own? The upside to all of this is we do actually have a system. So here in the UK, there's a system that pays authors, journalists, illustrators, whatever, for secondary use of their works. It's weirdly specifically to do with photocopying. So when photocopiers were invented, we addressed this issue, and they set up this organization called ALCS. I can't actually remember what it stands for, but every year they pay me from a chunk of government cash that I'm assuming, I don't know, photocopying companies had to pay in at some point. And I just get a check in the mail paying for the use of my work. So technology has made it easier to copy my work. So I get paid for that by technology companies. Well, I feel like AI and whatever else slots really neatly into that. And that companies like Google and OpenAI could really make a lot of fans by just dropping some money into that system and saying, hey, yeah, we did use some stuff we shouldn't have. Here's us trying to pay back for it. And then I get a little bit better check, once a year. And everyone's kind of happy, and it helps me keep working. It lets them keep working. The idea that we could invent AGI, but we couldn't figure out how to pay writers, like just give me a break. We can do better than this. And it is not intellectual property that is holding back AI in any way, shape, or form. It's just them not wanting to pay for it when they pay for everything else.
Yeah, that's a fair enough answer to that one. We've got one question from the audience, from Nico McDonald. Nicole, what is your evidence that technology is moving really fast now compared to when, and how do you measure this?
Oh, so this is a good question. It's hard to measure the pace of technology. I would say that sort of, if you look at, 2 years ago, ChatGPT was just like a chatbot that we were all just goofing around with. And I remember I was writing stories kind of examining what ChatGPT was capable of a couple of years ago, and we were like laughing at it, like it can't do very much. And I still don't think it's a very good writer, but it seems like most people don't care about that. But it has come on in leaps and bounds. Like, we have been able to see it go from kind of a fun toy to something that is embedded into businesses in a matter of like years. And I've been doing this for 20 years or whatever, and there's very few technologies that I would say have had an impact that quickly. Now, personally, I don't think AI has actually had a massive impact. Like, I think we're really at the early stages of it, and that 30 years from now, we're going to look back and see that this line of uptake is in actual utility is actually much slower than it feels like to me at in this moment. But if you kind of look back a little bit longer, when all of the switch to GPUs was happening, that was like early 2000s. We're talking 20 years when that kind of stuff was happening. And you go back a little bit further, and I mean, I think Geoffrey Hinton's been working on this stuff since like the 90s. You go back further, the idea of neural networks, this idea of a neural network, is from, I think, kind of early 60s. I think it was even discussed at kind of the first AI conference. Like, I think people were talking about this idea, this way of thinking, this framework. So we're talking like 1956, but they were talking a single one. And then we managed to get like a couple of them working together. And it just took decades and decades before we realized that computing was going to expand enough to enable more. So it's not that I think technology is happening faster. It's just, I think we're in the speed up for this particular type of AI. We're kind of at the acceleration point for it, for where it's kind of getting useful and where we're getting to interact with it. I mean, none of us would have been interacting with a neural network in the 50s, 60s, or 70s unless we worked in like a couple of universities. And now anybody who's listening to this at, at home or in their office can just pull GTP up and fact check me if they want as we go. And that kind of bit, the coming into use bit, the productization bit, is always the fastest because the hard work has been done, over the past 20 years with trying to make these systems work with GPUs and designing new ways of, using LLMs and stuff. So I guess that's kind of a way of arguing with myself that I think with technologies we've had for a really long time that are starting to show up in our daily lives, which is why we're talking about them. It's faster now because we're seeing all the little iterative changes, and it's things that actually impact us because we can actually play with it. But the stuff, the early work in AI in the 1950s and 60s probably felt just as exciting to the people who were working on it, and just as fast to the people who were working on it. So I guess in conclusion, yes, AI is developing more quickly right now, but also it's not. And that's why all of this stuff is so hard to figure out.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's a terrible answer.
No, it's a good answer. It's the point is it's complex and it's not straightforward and as easy as some people would like to think it is. One person in the comments, so I do not fully agree with the idea that a lack of diversity was the reason for the Silicon Valley AI companies not going through the improve cycle. In my view, this has much more to do with their funding narrative and funding structure, which is about getting larger and attracting more money, not about getting more efficient. What do you think of that one?
Yeah, I think we are kind of sort of saying the same thing. So what they did is they decided that this was the right idea. Their investors just agreed with them, and they just kind of got stuck in this loop of more money, please. Plonk. We got our money to pay for our systems. Let's just go, go, go. Let's run at this. And OpenAI is seeing Google doing basically the same thing, and seeing Anthropic doing basically the same thing. So they're in this little race where they don't feel like they have the time or ability, I guess, to kind of stop and rethink what they're doing and reconsider what they're doing. Now, if I had billions and was an investor looking at this, I'd be like, what else are we doing? What else are we considering? In case you're wrong, what are developers in China doing? Do we have any real sense of that? And I'm sure some investors are doing that, but I think they get drowned out by that race. So absolutely, the funding model it just exacerbates it. It just kind of winds the whole thing up because you are just running at money, which means that you've got to get a new feature out. Like last year, publications I work for were writing about what happens when OpenAI runs out of money. They were genuinely worried it wasn't going to get, the 6 or 7 billion that it needed right then to pay its bills. And then handily, it starts putting out a whole bunch of feature updates right before it goes asking for money, which is how tech works. You got to get the attention. You got to convince your investors that you're still doing something. And if you said to your investors, oh, we're doing all this stuff around efficiency, and we're not really worried about the race with Google and Anthropic. We're just going to focus on making the system more efficient. I think some investors would appreciate that because it, can help with the costs and the bottom line. But that's not the phase we're in right now. We're in the racing phase. And I do think they would have gotten to that point because investors are already starting to put their hands up and being like, hey, how can we cut costs? How can we do this smarter and be more efficient with it? So I think we would have gotten there in the end. So it's not just like, this is what I kind of mean about diversity of thinking. It's not just about having different sorts of people, but it's about having a willingness to listen to different sorts of people. And an organization that would keep somebody like Timnit Gebru, who wrote this paper, and listen to her and, really sit down and consider what she's saying is the same type of organization that is going to listen to that, investor in the back room, who, in the back of the room, who keeps putting their hand up and saying, yes, but what about keeping costs down through efficiency? An organization that ignores both of them is what we've got. And we need an organization that listens to both of them. And that's sort of what we don't have. So I agree, basically.
We have one from Judy Backhouse as well. And Judy asks, what about the possibility of a future in which we don't need jobs in order to feed ourselves? Can what you have learned about innovation in science be applied to innovation in socioeconomic systems?
So I was talking before about this idea of different things that we need to be looking at. If AI is going to become as important as everyone seems to think it is going to have this huge impact, then this is exactly the type of question I think we need to be answering, because we will need innovation because innovation, of course, is not just about technology and engineering. That's kind of what I focused on because I come from a technology background in terms of my journalism. But if we get to a point where we are working less, or we are required less, from companies, we need to think about what that means for the structure of our society. And we're already seeing that with 4-day work week and flexible working. That didn't come from any kind of innovation. Innovation enabled that when the pandemic hit. But now we have this issue where parents want to keep their kids home from school on Fridays because they're home and they're not working, and they want to see their kid or go do something fun or travel with them and things like that. And the school system isn't reacting to that quickly enough. And it's, there's not enough options for what parents want to do with that. And like, that's one really, really small example. But if we're not going into the office every day and having to work, or we don't need to work at all, well, where does our money come from? Are we going to start taxing companies differently? So there's all these ideas around, taxing AI agents. If you have an AI agent, they have to pay almost like the equivalent of like a income tax, or, how many robots you use, and you have to pay a head count. I mean, they're always going to get around simple ideas like that. But, how do we deal with all of this? If people stop driving and just start taking driverless cars, well, who is going to pay for roads? Because a lot of the money that comes out of cars through just their purchase or through petrol and stuff like that goes back into the government, not directly to pay for roads, but we're going to have the shortage of taxes from all these different fronts. So maybe we need to rethink how government is structured, how taxes are structured, how we pay for everything. Those are huge, huge societal shifts, and they're going to require massive amounts of innovation. And we have some interesting ideas like universal basic income and things like that. But I think that's just like tip of the iceberg stuff. If none of us are working, we're not going to have tax money, and we're not going to have money to buy the things that are made from these companies, and governments aren't going to operate. We've got a huge kind of power vacuum. We've got a money and kind of organizational background issue. Like we're going to have to completely reorganize society if things happen the way that these companies say they're going to. So the thing that I would like to see is that people talk about, how we keep up with this. How as individuals do we make sure that we're ready for this? What we need to have is good government and real leadership that understands these kinds of issues. And right now we've got leaders, it doesn't matter where in the world you are, we've got leadership that are struggling to find jobs for people even now, that are struggling to understand how best to end inequity now. And these systems, things like AI or driverless or any of this, are just going to put so much more power into corporate hands and just kind of widen all of those gaps. So we're going to have more unemployment. We're going to have more inequity. We need to get really, like, so I'm rambling a bit. We were talking earlier about this idea of having, in academia, do we have enough innovation happening? Do we have the right kind of people studying the right things? And we need that in, sociology. We need that from economists. We need that from governing as well. We need people who are at university now to understand technology, to understand the implications, and to care what happens to all of us, so that they can innovate a system for organizing society, like basically a new form of government, a new form of economic system. Because we need to start thinking about this stuff now, because none of this is going to be easy. None of it's going to be obvious. So yes, more innovation in everything just to keep up with all of this.
I think that also speaks to something you touched on earlier and towards the end of your book, which is about who drives the future and who is responsible for these technologies. And a lot of people in the tech industry think that there is some tech solution to any problem, and oftentimes it's not the case. And tech solutions can create their own problems in and of themselves. And so maybe that's something also to think about as we have some, let's say, tech enthusiasts who are more openly in the policy-making arena at the moment as well. Very quickly, one final question, if you can answer it in 1 minute. We have another from Nico McDonald. We shouldn't be taking flights for short distances if we're having to fly over cities because of traffic. Perhaps we should fix traffic. If we took this attitude in London in the 1850s, we never built an underground railway system, a transport model which has transformed life in the economies of cities around the world. Why can't we innovate in transport systems today? Can you answer that in 1 minute, please, Nicole?
Yeah, so the underground was solving a different problem. It was trying to move people more quickly. And now we have a problem where we have too many cars on the road, so that the average speed of a car or a bus in London is 9 miles an hour, which is the same as when we had horses pulling them. So we can come up with all sorts of different systems for, moving people around, but we need to think about mass movement of people. And I don't personally think that flying taxis and just having tons of them in the sky, we'd have to have so many of them to make up for the amount of people that are in cars or the amount of people that you could move with the train. And we have a really good train as an example of how to quickly move people, and that's the Elizabeth line. Now, the problem is it was really expensive to build, and it took a long time to build. So instead of just seeing innovation in flying cars, which, like, let's do that. I'm not saying don't do it, but let's also put more innovation into how could we build trains much more quickly and much more cheaply so that we could have multiple Elizabeth lines. And we're not just building a new train line every 40 years, we're building them every 4 years. Because if we just had a whole bunch of those in there, yeah, that would be a much better solution than tiny, little drone things above our heads.
Yeah, but yeah, as you said, it's expensive, and thinking about the vision and what people are telling us the future should look like as well. All of these things weigh in. Thank you for everyone for all the questions, and it was really interesting to discussion today, and it's provided so much food for thought. I hope everyone in the audience found it useful as well. If you have enjoyed today's event and want to find out more about future technology, please join us at our Future Signals live event taking place on the 27th of February at our central London office, where we will be talking about things like translating the language of plants, energy island, humanoid robot etiquette, and a few other things. A link to register your attendance will be shared in the chat. And now that we have reached the end of this event, we'd be really grateful if those joining us in the audience could please fill out a very short survey. The link will be shared in the chat. And as a thank you for filling out the survey, you'll be entered into a prize draw to win a £50 bookshop.org voucher. And if you haven't already, please sign up for Nesta's newsletter, and we will let you know about other events coming up. The link to the newsletter will be posted in the comments section on YouTube and LinkedIn. So just to say again, thank you very much to Nicole for joining us today. It's a really interesting discussion, and I hope everyone has a good day.